It's the 21st of April, 2015, and this is episode 206. This show is intended for informational and educational purposes only. What cryptocurrency enables is new, empowering, and exciting, but we're not experts. Just obsessed companions walking the road towards a more peer-to-peer future. Welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show about the ideas, people, and projects enabled by and empowering Bitcoin along with the cryptocurrency movement at large. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm the editor-in-chief here at Let's Talk Bitcoin, and today we close another chapter. Charlie Shrem, who we first met as the enthusiastic CEO of BitInstant back in 2013, is doing time at the Lewisburg Federal Prison Camp in Pennsylvania following 14 months of house arrest. It wasn't long ago that he joined Andreas, Stephanie, and I to talk Bitcoin, his story, and the lessons he's learned through this difficult situation. For ways to contact or support Charlie, visit charlieshrem.com. I kind of want to talk about the origins of BitInstant and what it was like at the early days there. And the other thing I want to talk about is what you see as the kind of opportunities that are in the space now that are quite similar. Because, I've heard you talk about the origins of BitInstant, and you described it as starting from a $10,000 loan from your parents, and it kind of just growing explosively from there within a reasonably short period of time. Why was BitInstant, why was solving the liquidity problem, or at least acting as an interface for dollars, why was that the thing when you started BitInstant, and has that problem been solved?
Going back many years in 2009, 2010, when I started hearing about Bitcoin, it was almost impossible to actually get it and to play with it and to test it and to see what it was like. But once you did, there was like this sparkle in your eye, and it happened to everyone I spoke to. Once you open up a wallet and you had some Bitcoins on your phone or on your computer, and when you realize what you can do with it, there was kind of that whoa moment. And we realized really early on that this thing is really hard to get. At the time, I think the only two exchanges that existed, well, there were a few, but barely doing any volume, but there was Mt. Gox and TradeHill, Can't BX, but they were doing such low liquidity, low volume. You had to, wire money to some shady bank account somewhere, and it was kind of complicated and it needed to be easier. And you wanted it, Bitcoin had that like instant factor. Oh, this is really cool, let me get some. And then 10 seconds go by. If you can't get it, you totally lose interest. And that happened to me. I liked it. It was very cheap. It was, 10, 50 cents or whatever. I really liked it. But there was just like, all right, it's too hard to get. And I forgot about it until a few months later, I heard about it again. And I tried again to get it. And it was still too difficult. And finally, the third or fourth time, I opened up a TradeHill account. And I said, I'm going to take the plunge. I'm going to do this. And I had to think of it. It was like getting a mortgage. It was a whole to-do. Finally, when I wired money, TradeHill, that same day, ING closed TradeHill's account and my money was frozen. And I was so angry. And I remember calling up Jared Kenna's TradeHill. I give him credit for really introducing. He was one of the first people that I actually spoke to over voice about Bitcoin before. Other than that, it was all IRC and stuff like that. I never spoken to anyone about Bitcoin over my voice. I don't even know how to pronounce the word Bitcoin until I spoke to Jared. We talked about it. And he's like, look, I'll get my bank thing sorted out. I'll credit you the money and you can get some Bitcoins. And I thank him for doing that. But I said to myself, dude, this is the most impossible thing in the world to do. So BitInstant came up with an idea. Was my partner Gareth Nelson, posted on the Bitcoin forums one day, and he said, I have this idea to make buying Bitcoins easier. And so I messaged him and I said, what's your idea? And he said, well, I have an idea to connect an ACH provider, Dwolla, with TradeHill. And TradeHill had stopped working with Dwolla because they lost them a ton of money. There were a lot of ACH chargebacks. But Gareth had figured out a way to mitigate this risk. And I said, all right, so let's do it. Tell me where to wire you the money. And so Gareth and I went into partnership. Till today, we never met. We barely would speak on the phone. And we made it easy for people to be able to go to bitinstant.com. We'd pull in their bank account information, and they'd be able to buy Bitcoins within a few hours. And it was really easy. And slowly we realized that this thing actually can take off, and we needed to make it even easier than that. So we made a partnership with cash deposit companies, and we had the ability for someone to walk into a local Walmart, CVS, Duane Reade, any of the banks, deposit money into our account, and the software would instantly, literally within minutes, deposit either dollars in their exchange account or give them Bitcoin. And we started to see volume like ramp up. You're saying $1,000 a day, $10,000 a day, $50,000 a day. I think at our peak we were doing something like $500,000 to $600,000 a day. Just to think that every 30 seconds there was someone walking into a Walmart or CVS to buy Bitcoin was just an extraordinary thought. It's crazy to think about, because we were doing 2-3 transactions a day. And so divided by the amount of minutes in a day, it was a crazy thought to think about. When the company grew,
you were giving people something they actually wanted. BitInstant was so convenient.
It was so convenient.
Yeah.
Till today, I still see comments like, I saw BitQuick was on the Reddit the other day, and someone, the highest voted comment was, "This is like a hybrid of BitInstant and local Bitcoins. How I miss those days." It was a lot easier to buy Bitcoin back then. It's still very difficult to buy Bitcoin. Like even Coinbase and Circle, it's very difficult. You have to give up so much information. I spoke to someone the other day, and he saw that Amazon created a digital currencies section for books. And he thought that Amazon was selling Bitcoin. And he kind of freaked out because he's a big local Bitcoins dealer that does kind of cash deposits into his own bank account, kind of what BitInstant used to do. And he's like, I freaked out, but I know that I still have my strong customer base, because even if Amazon did sell Bitcoin, upload your documents, enter your social security number, go through a whole process, where people on local Bitcoins, it's like the easiest thing in the world to buy Bitcoin on local Bitcoins. You click a button of a guy who has good ratings, he sends you the payment instructions, you deposit Bitcoin dollars into his account, and you have Bitcoins in 5 minutes. It's so easy.
It's a barrier for people sometimes who feel intimidated by that, though. Some people just hear, "Oh, really? I'm going to deal with some person I don't know on the internet? Too scary."
You're right. It needs to be a company, but if you look at it, it's only in America that this exists. There are Bitcoin companies in Austria, Thailand, UK, all over Europe, where you can buy Bitcoins with cash. It's very easy to do it. It's very easy to buy and sell Bitcoin in other places around the world. You can walk into any 7-Eleven in Thailand and sell Bitcoin right there for cash.
And the difference in America is just the enforcement regime?
Enforcement, but just mostly regulation. It's very hard to start a Bitcoin company. And I remember watching the other day a foreign affairs panel with, the director of FinCEN, and then you had the chief compliance officer at Circle. And the chief compliance officer at Circle was saying, I'm really happy for the Bit license, because, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you can afford these licensing schemes. And I was going to yell at him, right? I said, no, because you raised $30 million, you can afford to pay your salary. But guys who are doing the real innovation in the Bitcoin space are doing it in their garages. And they can't afford for these regulatory schemes. And they can't afford lawyers. You have the guys who did all the Bitcoin stuff at MIT got subpoenaed by New Jersey. It's scary. It's scary to do anything Bitcoin related unless you raise a ton of money and you're not scared to do it.
That's the whole point of regulation, is to create barriers to competition by making it expensive. The point was never consumer protection. It never worked as consumer protection. It was never even justice or crime prevention. Regulation may have been originally instituted in these spaces as an immediate knee-jerk response to some crime or fraud, but over time it loses its meaning until eventually it simply becomes overhead that big companies can afford to pay to keep small companies from competing with them. It doesn't protect anyone other than the jobs of the regulators and the big companies from competition.
And that's what happened in the early days of Bitcoin, was that you'd have companies like PayPal, Western Union, that have all the money transmitter licenses in all the 50 states, and it costs, tens of millions of dollars to have this. And Bitcoin companies weren't rich. They were passionate, but no one really raised money yet. My company, BitInstant, raised the largest amount in those days, and that was $1 million. And that's not nearly enough to do anything, but we were passionate and we wanted to change the law. So we'd become close with, like, for example, the National Money Transmitter Association, who wanted to combine all of the state licensing schemes to make it cheap and easy to start a new startup in the financial services space. And he was excited because now he has people on his team. He has Bitcoin companies that don't have a lot of money. And you're fighting the kind of the payments roundtable of companies like PayPal, Western Union, and et cetera, that can afford this. But now that's kind of over. And there's a gap between Bitcoin startups and Bitcoin companies now, where Bitcoin companies like Circle, Coinbase, that raised all this money, They want the licensing schemes, not for consumer protections, not for all of these things that they claim to want them for, but they want them because it gives them a competitive advantage. They know that it's now that much harder for anyone to compete against them.
One of the particularly interesting things about the BitInstant model compared to any of the really kind of surviving outlets that I can think of is that BitInstant largely dealt in cash and things that were irreversible in order to get around some of the issues like Circle or Coinbase or any of these things. They can either put a charge on your credit card, they can change your balance of Bitcoin held within their service, they can do a pull from your bank account.
We're giving up way too much information, and yes, there's consumer protection issues there, because how do you know some guy's not using some old grandma's bank account to buy Bitcoin and steal all her money? We never had those issues, really, with BitInstant. We never had consumer protection issues. No one was depositing cash into our account and saying, oh, I didn't mean to do that. You were kind of self-regulatory in a way.
Yeah, so I guess the question here is, do you see anybody in the space taking the approach to it that you guys took with BitInstant? And regardless, do you think that having a business like BitInstant is viable in the current environment?
We're seeing companies try to do it. We're seeing a few different companies that are latching on to many middlemen to do it, right? You're seeing the ability to, like companies like I think TrueCoin and a lot of these exchanges allowing you to deposit into their bank account. But it's stupid. I'll tell you why. People don't realize that there are different types of customers that want to buy Bitcoin. There's the guy who wants to buy it to use it. There's the guy who wants to buy to trade. There's the guy who wants to buy large amounts and hold. There's a guy who wants to do remittance. There are different reasons to wanting to buy Bitcoin. You can't all just drop them into one bucket. You know, guys email me every day. It's like, I want to start a Bitcoin exchange. But why? Bitcoin exchange serves one small consumer base of Bitcoin. There's really still no easy, simple way to buy Bitcoin. And so that consumer base needs to be served. And you know where they're going? They're going to local Bitcoins, and they're going to these smaller companies that aren't well funded to do it, or they're going to companies outside of America.
Or they're using ATMs, which is actually really interesting because that's causing an explosion in the deployment of Bitcoin ATMs, even in the US. Because it's so
Bitcoin
difficult.
ATM model is amazing. It's still too expensive to use them though, but it's amazing. The cheapest I've ever seen is someone charging like 7% over the current price. But you know what? It was the same thing when regular ATMs came out. When regular ATMs came out, they were a novelty. Oh, you know, you don't need to go to the bank now to get cash out of your account. You're going to have to pay for that premium. But as more ATMs start being deployed and they start competing with each other, it'll become cheaper to use them, unless you now need a license to operate a Bitcoin ATM, and only one or two Bitcoin companies can afford those licensing, and only their ATMs are now being deployed, and there's no competition anymore. Prices will stay high. And it goes back to my original point. Regulation reduces competition. And if there's no competition, then prices are high, and it's bad for the consumers.
Do you think that there's a right amount of regulation here?
I think that creating one regulatory scheme for every company is a bad idea. Every company needs to be looked at as a case-by-case basis, as it is in Europe. In every country, and I've said this before, every European country has their own regulatory body for financial services. The good thing about it is that if you are licensed in one Eurozone country, you are licensed in every other Eurozone country, so you don't need to get licensed in every single country. But further, like Tony from BitPay can tell you, each company is looked at as a case-by-case basis. You have a case manager, you go into his office, he's handling your account all the time until he grants you or doesn't grant you a license. You get a transitional license that allows you to do business while they're trying to figure out if you need a license or if they're going to give you one or not. There are different fee structures. There are different types. There's what's called a small business institutional license, something like that, for like depending on how much dollar amounts you do. They're all different types of schemes. And that works a lot better than the simple, you need a money transmitter license in this state, no matter how much business you do, put down a $5 million bond and have a nice day.
Right. One size fits all rules that don't fit very well at all.
It doesn't work.
They fit very well, as long as you have
the money to do it.
Hundreds of millions of dollars and the ability to pay for the regulation cost. What's Charlie going to be up to next? How are you going to spend the next 2 years? Are you going to be able to speak publicly and communicate with the community? What's next for Charlie?
Sure. I've been employed by a major media company to write blog posts while I'm in prison. It'll be announced sometime in the next few weeks. But the plan is for me to start before I go in, kind of write about my preparations, what I'm working on, and what it's like to essentially go to federal prison. Because people don't know really what that's like and what it's like on the inside. And they're interested in me being able to write about that. So I plan on being able to write 3 to 4 articles a month while I'm inside. Continue working on my book that I started about a year and a half ago. And when I get out, we'll see what happens from there. I'm definitely leaving New York for a while. I can tell you that. I think there are much better Bitcoin hubs. And if I have to stay in the country, there are a lot better Bitcoin hubs, for example, in California and in Austin, Texas, that I'd like to be at.
Was this a felony or just misdemeanor?
I'm a felon for life. I'm the first Bitcoin felon.
Okay, so that may affect your ability to leave, huh?
In the short amount of time, yes. I'm under supervised release, so I can travel internationally, but I can't move internationally for like the first maybe like 6 months.
If you could go anywhere in the world and start a Bitcoin company or just relax and do what you want to do, where would you go right now?
I see a big potential for Bitcoin in Argentina. I spent a bunch of time in Buenos Aires. There are a lot of Bitcoin companies down there that are doing a lot of amazing things. The Argentinian government has been putting together a lot of funds for incubators, and these incubators like NXT Labs are funding Bitcoin companies. Just recently, I was invited to like an all-paid expenses trip down there to consult for more Bitcoin companies, and I see the places that Bitcoin can provide the most utility adopting. Americans don't really need Bitcoin. I mean, what's the underbanked percentage here? Not that much. People are somewhat satisfied with financial services. Yes, it could do better, but there are places in the world where there are real financial services issues. And I see that in Latin America. I see that in Greece. I see that in a lot of the Eastern European countries. And if I can help in any way possible there, I'd love to be there.
It strikes me that although certainly we may not have a large underbanked population in the United States, the competition angle, I think, is something that is very required and something that certainly we could benefit from quite a lot in this country.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not that happy being banked right now.
I'd argue it depends how you count. If you also count undocumented immigrants, migrant workers, seasonal workers,
teenagers and children,
and you also count minorities who are unbanked or underbanked in the U.S., you're looking at about 18% of the population, and that's almost 50 million people in this country. A good 25 million people are undocumented immigrants who can't access not only can they not access traditional banking facilities, but they can't even access the new regulated Bitcoin exchanges like Circle and Coinbase. So for them, services that offer Bitcoin for remittances are really restricted to local Bitcoins and ATMs, and they need it the most.
I agree.
I thought we started calling them JP Morgan Coinbase.
That's pretty funny. I agree with you guys, and I think there's a big potential for Bitcoin in the U.S., but I'm the type of person that goes after the lowest hanging fruit. And if I can provide an example of a successful utility of Bitcoin in a place where it's really needed, I want to go after that first and use that as a test case or a springboard onto changing the way we bank in America.
Charlie, early on, you were one of the first people into Bitcoin to really build a business around providing services at that kind of infrastructure level. What do you see as the opportunity now? Is it Argentina? Are you, when you get done with this, that's where you're headed because that's where you're going to build a business? And what type of businesses do you think right now are the greatest opportunity that you can see? If it's not exchanges, what is it?
One of the questions that I get all the time is what makes Bitcoin valuable? And I know that it's a very long, deep answer and depends on what, economic school of thought you follow. But one of the answers I kind to in a pseudo way is I like to say that Bitcoin is essentially a share in this amazing technology called the blockchain. And by providing more utility and showing what the blockchain is actually good for, I feel like we can push Bitcoin forward. So I'd like to see more people use the blockchain for amazing things. And one of the ideas I dabbled with, and I saw this in the recent Bitcoin Foundation elections, was I'd like to see a company take on the ability to use the blockchain for conducting elections. I know that someone said to the Bitcoin Foundation, why aren't you using the blockchain for running the elections? Because the elections are always mired with scandal. And they said in a tweet, like, do you know any good companies that are actually doing this? And the guy said, no, there aren't. any actually. And then I read an article on The Economist that says, all these countries go through like an Arab Spring, or they have military coups every year, and then we're going to have democratic elections. But elections are not cheap. Elections are very expensive, and it's a taxpayer that are paying for the price of elections. And once you actually cast your vote, where is the chain of title for that vote? Who's actually the election commission? Who's actually telling you that they're not corrupt? And so a lot of issues that you see are problems with people claiming that the elections are not free and fair. So I'd like to dabble and like to spend my time in prison thinking about the blueprints for creating a way to provide countries or companies or foundations or nations or states or municipalities a turnkey solution to running cheap but free and fair elections using the blockchain.
You left the Bitcoin Foundation, right, Charlie, even though you basically founded it. What do you think of the current status of the Bitcoin Foundation and its future? If you want to talk about that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I'm really happy that they're having elections, and I'm really happy that a lot of people, not a lot of people, but a few people want to disband the Bitcoin Foundation because they think it's whatever. But they don't realize that the foundation itself is its own entity, and it has bylaws. And I feel like it's agile enough that if you have a good board, or if you had a good group of people that are running it, I think it could change and it could conform to what it actually is, what is actually is needed.
Sounds a lot like we just need to elect the right people. I don't know.
It does, It's interesting. You want to hear something funny? Yes, it needs to elect the right people. And fortunately enough, it is only costs $25 to become a member and to vote. And someone the other day wrote a blog post saying, I don't believe in foundations that are elected. I believe that people need to be appointed, because elections throws you under the
tyranny of the masses.
Yeah, exactly. And so that can't be, because you lose your vision. But I kind of believe the opposite. I believe that in very small cases, I think the electorate is a good form of democracy, and that if people can vote on things.
So do you think of the Bitcoin Foundation as a government?
Bitcoin Foundation only represents its members and not the Bitcoin community as a whole. Its members sign up because they want to see change in how certain things are done within the Bitcoin space. I'll tell you this, we started the Bitcoin Foundation for a totally different reason. Bitcoin Foundation was started for Bitcoin companies to pool their minimal assets together and create one conformed voice. So we were going to pool our money together to be able to do advertising and be like one voice for the media and one voice for the press and things like that.
It was a centralization at a time when there was no centralization at all.
It wasn't centralization per se. We weren't centralizing.
Well, you were. You were trying to centralize the minimum resources that you had so that you could put together a stronger voice so that it wasn't confusing, and people who were expecting centralized, people who were expecting somebody who could explain to them about Bitcoin, that your organization could fill that role. So it was never really intended to be a member organization in the way that it has sort of become. You're saying that's what the need pivoted to. And so it could be that if people fix the bylaws using the bylaws, but that's hard.
What would you like to see the foundation become?
The thing that I always argued for personally was a very agnostic, like the bare basics of what could possibly be construed as Bitcoin. You encode the neutrality. I'm just trying to explore what the intention was, because it seems like it changed over time. It seems like the organization that was created has become a very different one as time has gone on.
Yeah, it's very different. We started the foundation somewhat, not out of fear, but out of worry that the community was going to kind of fizzle off and Bitcoin would fizzle away, and us Bitcoin companies would kind of lose our passion. And the Bitcoin companies were pretty fractured back then. There was a community. We all knew each other, but there was nothing official. By creating a foundation, you created some sense of like, not entitlement, but you're creating some sense of like future, legacy. And the idea of you leaving some sort of legacy will keep that flame alive. And I feel like it helped in some way.
Absolutely. At the in the time where you guys were starting it, I think centralization in a way that implies that, this is evil. It's just to say that if all around you there is nothing but chaos, then the thing that needs to be created is some form of non-chaos. And so that's, to a certain extent, what centralization compared to decentralization is.
It's a scale, because what you just said is the ideal way. But the problem is that once you give some sort of centralization, that automatically implies power. And once you give someone power, there's no stopping that power. So the foundation needed to tread that fine line of, we're not going to be a power organization. Rather, we're going to be some sort of centralized decentralization. And I really wanted to model this after kind of the kibbutz model in Israel. And the way the kibbutz model work is that you have kind of like socialist in a way, but there's still a body that kind of governs the communal organization. But even the guy who is president of the communal body has to clean the kitchen once a month. There's still that everyone is the same at the end of the day.
Today's episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin is brought to you by the LTB Companion multi-token wallet, available for free now in the Chrome store or at letstalkbitcoin.com/wallet. Developer Joe Looney just added the ability in the most recent version to send Bitcoin, LTB coin, or any other tokens directly to other letstalkbitcoin.com usernames. So instead of having to worry about Bitcoin addresses, all you have to do is just figure out the username of the person in the community who you're trying to reach, and then you enter their name, and when you click the send button, the wallet automatically grabs the public Bitcoin address associated with their account and plugs it in right for you. So if you want to send Joe Looney a tip, rather than trying to find his Bitcoin address, you could just send it to Loon3 because that's his username on letstalkbitcoin.com. Some other people you could send him to: Andreas, Stephanie, Adam, that's my username on the platform. Rob from the Bitcoin game uses Rob, R-O-B. John Light from P2P Connects Us just uses the name John. John Barrett uses John Barrett, 2 words put together. Any username that you can find on there, if they've already signed up for the LTB rewards program, then all you need to do to send them any tokens is send it to their username. Things like sending directly to usernames is only possible through the LTB Companion wallet, and we're very much not done yet. You can expect to see many more features and integrations as we go. If you'd like to be able to receive Bitcoins or tokens directly to your username, make sure you've listed your LTB Companion or Counter Wallet address using the Address Verifier tool in your Let's Talk Bitcoin dashboard. And speaking of your LTB dashboard, while you're there, make sure you enter the magic word for episode 206, which is WINGS. That's W-I-N-G-S, WINGS. You've got until the 28th of April to visit letstalkbitcoin.com or the Let's Talk Bitcoin iOS app to enter it for your share of the listener rewards.
I'm trying not to approach this with this somber tone. I almost feel in a way like we're all going to your funeral or something, and that's not true. That's not the case.
If I was going away for 30 years, then it would be a funeral. What they wanted. When I meet people and I tell people, and I would say yeah, I'm not going to prison. And I really thought at the end, at least, that the judge would not want to use me as an example. I kind of looked up to, I think the judge is this judge specifically is a very independent figure. We submitted a 100-page sentencing memo, and the government submitted a 3-page one basically saying Charlie needs to be an example, and that was it.
Charlie, fill us in on what's been happening over the past year.
I'm an early Bitcoin investor, entrepreneur in the space. A lot of people know of me, know me. I try to meet everyone I can. A brief background is I started one of the first Bitcoin companies that ran for the 3 early years of Bitcoin called BitInstant, and we allow people to buy Bitcoin at 1 million or so locations under the premise that if we can get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible, this thing could take off. As we were winding down that company and more startups came into the space, myself with a group of a few other people co-founded Bitcoin Foundation, and I served as its vice chairman. Consulted with a few dozen companies in the space and embarked on a speaking tour. While on that speaking tour, I was coming home from one in Amsterdam, about to head to another one in Miami. I was arrested by a consortium of FBI, DEA, airport security, ATF, U.S. Marshal Service, and NYPD agents, very large guns, at the airport. Originally, they arrested me for a multitude of charges, including money laundering and a bunch of other stuff. They were threatening me with serving 30-something years in a federal prison when I was 23. We fought a long, hard case. We didn't give in. I did not become an informant. I did not go to trial either. I ended up at the end taking a plea for something like aiding and abetting an unlicensed money transmitter business, which usually people never get jail time for. They just get a fine. But I was made an example of, and I was sentenced to 2 years. And I'll be heading there at the end of March.
And your age right now?
Now I'm 25. I just turned 25.
A ridiculous show of force, completely out of proportion. You could basically argue that for the heinous crime of being 3 people removed, potentially selling Bitcoins to somebody who sold them to other people who may have bought drugs with them, you are now going to be going to prison, and you got sentenced to 2 years. You probably won't be in for the whole 2 years, but
the problem is, at the end of the day, is that according to the law that I pled guilty to, I did break it. I mean, there's a book somewhere that there's a law written on it that says you can't knowingly give someone something knowing they're going to use it for an illicit purpose, no matter how steps removed you are. And there's a law, and I did break it. There are emails, and I knew that these Bitcoins, one customer out of the 200,000 customers that we had was going to be using Bitcoins for Silk Road. And I broke that. But a more important question, is that law just? Is that a just law? And 2, was I the victim of what people say is unfair prosecution? And I think those are 2 really important questions.
Or even more broadly, if that law is just, and really that's perhaps a bigger philosophical question, even if you accept that law is just, is it applied equally?
Oh, absolutely not.
HSBC is currently being investigated not only for facilitating tax evasion for some 100,000 customers in their Switzerland branch, but they have twice been caught facilitating money laundering to the Sinaloa cartel, and together with Wachovia, they money laundered approximately $700 billion during the height of the U.S. drug war in Mexico, which resulted in the deaths of 19,000 people, and not a single executive from either of those banks has gone to jail, despite the fact that HSBC has been in the drug funding, money laundering business since its inception. It was really created as an opiate bank in Hong Kong and continues that long tradition. Not a single executive has ever gone to jail, even though they were convicted of 19,000 violations of anti-money laundering rules. Not a single one of them went to jail. Now, comparatively, based on the charge you faced, I would assume that if the law was applied equally, the entire upper echelon of HSBC Bank would be facing hundreds of consecutive life sentences. There is no question about whether the law is being applied equally. It absolutely is not.
The government has to apply some sort of return on investment type of algorithm where they say, who can we prosecute the easiest, the cheapest, and will get us the most effect? And I'm the perfect candidate for that. I was a figurehead. I was someone who was very controversial, still am, to the government. I had the media, I still do, and the public on my side. And I go out and I'm like Roger Ver, where I don't care what I say and I make the government look like fools. And so it's easy, cheap to intimidate a 23-year-old kid from Brooklyn. And it gets a lot of press. I mean, I get more press than anything if I was arrested, and it makes them look good. Preet Bharara gets to make a nice press release, and it boosts his MO when he wants to have a political career. I feel like it's as simple as that. There's no incentive to really go after HSBC executives. There's no incentive to do that.
Other than the fact that it would allow for the punishment of crimes that are directly linked to tens of thousands of deaths in Mexico over the last decade. There is the question of whether justice is meant to offer retribution or prevention, and whether justice should be applied in the case where are the greatest victims who have suffered the greatest harm.
Andreas, that's exactly what the question was that my lawyers and the government argued at my sentencing. And I actually just got a copy of the minutes, which I'm going to hopefully publish on my site, of the sentencing hearing. But that's exactly what they argued. The government argued in a very brief memo that we need to punish Charlie as prevention, and we need to put him away for a long time to essentially prevent other people from committing the same crimes. Now, that split into two arguments. At first, it split into, okay, if we decide that prison time is actually needed, then how much? Is there a difference over a year and 30 years? And then the second argument is a $1 million fine more of a preventative punishment than, say, a year in prison. For the first argument, thankfully, my judge, unlike the judge of Ross Ulbricht, my judge Rakoff said there is no distinction between, let's just say, 30 years and 2 years. However, he believes that there is a distinction between fining a kid of $1 million and sending this kid to prison.
It must be just surreal to hear these people arguing about the fate of your life and how you need to be punished for this thing and how there may not be a difference between you spending 2 years in prison or 30 years. I mean, I can't even imagine what that must have been like.
The numbers don't make sense because at the same time, the cost of trying my case, the government salary, the pretrial officer's salary, my probation officer's salary, the cost of keeping an ankle bracelet on my leg every day for a year, this all adds up. You're talking about millions of dollars of costs that you, the taxpayers, are paying. For what? How much profit did I actually make off this? My company made $15,000 in profit, not me, the company, and that's lost in operating capital. It's not even like realized profit. So was it worth it?
No, and I imagine you've already been fined with all the attorney fees and all the house arrest that you've basically not been able to go out of your home for a year. And I'm sorry, it's not funny. It's just ridiculous to hear myself talk about this. You've already been fined. And for what? Like we already established, what did you actually do? Did you actually cause any suffering to anybody? And no, I think you could argue that you absolutely didn't. And you probably improved some people's lives, maybe made it safer for them to, if you're talking about the end users who may have bought drugs after they bought Bitcoins from the guy who you sold them to, who sold them to someone else. It's ridiculous. You can't, where's the harm in that? Where's the victim?
You're right. I agree with the arguments that I was many steps removed. And I agree to the arguments that not all of the items sold on Silk Road were legal, and I may not have known, even though I had an idea that possibly these Bitcoins are being used for Silk Road. So it was very, very diluted. Those arguments are great. But at the end of the day, money laundering and the crime that I actually pled to, which is aiding and abetting unlicensed money transfer business, applies to drug trafficking. And you say to yourself, okay, drug trafficking, what does that mean? That means aiding the seller of drugs. I wasn't aiding the seller of drugs. I was aiding someone who wanted to buy drugs. And there's a major difference. I wasn't taking a drug dealer on Silk Road's $1 million worth of Bitcoin, taking a 10% cut and then giving him $900,000 here. I wasn't doing that. I was allowing someone who can make decisions for themselves to put something in their body that they want to do. And that's not drug trafficking. But the government was able to basically make the argument that by enabling the drug buyer, you're enabling the drug seller.
I think everyone on this particular podcast can agree to the fact that whatever we have in this country that passes for a justice system has at least 3 tiers. There are, people at the top who get infinite forgiveness for some of the most disgusting mega crimes and never face the tiniest consequence for their actions. You can put 1 million people out of their homes with fraudulent foreclosures. You'll never see the inside of a courtroom. You can rig markets, steal money from investors, defraud millions of people. You'll never see the inside of a courtroom. And yet there's the other side of the scale where you have a situation of zero tolerance, where the slightest infraction, selling a loose cigarette for 30 cents gets you a street side arrest, judgment, and execution by strangulation, where jaywalking gets you shot by a cop even if you're unarmed, and where cities run effectively debtors' prisons where they rotate people through there for traffic fines and keep accumulating them until they end up in jail for violating subpoenas and things like that, and run it as a for-profit enterprise. And then in the middle is the middle class, caught in this justice system, this thin layer that's getting thinner all the time because they're getting squeezed from the bottom. And the middle class sees the top of this country getting away with mega crimes and sees a wave of zero tolerance coming at them that used to only affect minorities, but now is increasingly taking bites out of the middle class. And they're struggling desperately not to fall into this Orwellian zero tolerance justice system. That's not justice. I think everyone on this call probably has a similar perspective to this, but effectively what we're talking about is an erosion of the rule of law. And the most fundamental concept of the rule of law is equality in judgment. If a law exists, there is one tier. Everybody faces the same consequences for breaking that law. And that fundamental social compact has been violated. And for some stratum of the society, it never really existed. Some people were always going to feel the heavy boot of law with no recourse, and suffered under that for 200 years. But now that is increasingly becoming the vast majority of the population. So you live in a society where the slightest mistake is very harshly punished. That's if you survive the police encounter. While you watch a country's so-called elite just roll from scandal to scandal, from crime to crime, with no one going to jail. War crimes, no jail time. Bank fraud, no jail time. All of these things, surveillance and violating the constitutional rights of millions of people, not even a misdemeanor issue. It just gets legalized after the fact. Lying to Congress, no problem. And then Preet can promote his resume by going after Charlie. It's really a disgusting situation, but I think it's a situation that has nothing to do with Bitcoin per se. It's just a universal collapse of justice and the rule of law in this country. One of the few countries that actually had it.
As that was so well said, I have no response to it. I completely agree with Andreas, everything he just said. It's not limited to Bitcoin. It's an overall, you see it with everything. I mean, look at the case of Aaron Schwartz. May he rest in peace. But once they have their sights on you, telling it's you per se, I think it's what you represent or who you are. There's no getting out of those sights. And the higher up you are, the harder it is for them to prosecute you. It just doesn't make sense for them. Our justice system has been corrupted or viewed to what it is today. And we can say that, but at the same time, let's pick specific parts of it. And I'm going to really nitpick at the concept of sentencing guidelines. For those who are not familiar, all federal crimes fall into something called the sentencing guidelines. And this was enacted by Congress a couple of years ago. And most judges follow it to the T. The way it works is that when you plead guilty or are found guilty of a crime, your crime and some other factors are assessed to a point system. And basically, that is how severe was the crime. But the factor that gives the most points is what is the monetary amount. So for me, that was $1 million. And $1 million has a lot more significance than 900,999. And what happens is that automatically gave me something called 20 points. Because it was a drug-related crime, another 5 points. Then another point for, I forget. So I had 26 points, which any other judge had to have given me 5 years for the crime I actually pled guilty to. But for the original crimes that I was first indicted for, The sentencing guidelines stipulated 30 years. And if I actually lost at trial to those 3 crimes, most judges would actually give me those 30 years. So the sentencing guideline is supposed to make it easier on judges because the government doesn't want judges to have discretion over what type of sentences to give. Thankfully, I have a judge that has written books and has written articles and has been very outspoken against the sentencing guidelines. And he uses sentencing hearings like mine that are covered by the press as his podium against the sentencing guidelines. And he made that fact. He said he started off my sentencing by saying the sentencing guideline says that I must give Charlie Shrem 5 years. And the government enacted by Congress makes it a law that I have to consider the sentencing guidelines in my sentence. Now I am stating, and he said these words, he said, I am stating a fact that I have considered the guidelines and I have found them to be unreasonable. Therefore, I will not use the guidelines in my sentence. And he said that before anyone made their arguments. And when he said that, I kind of said okay, I at least know that he's not going to follow the sentencing guidelines because any other judge would have. They would have to. Not pretty much. It's a law. You have to follow. You have to give them consideration.
The sentencing guidelines, what they do is they shift discretion from the judge to
probation office.
No, the legislative and executive branch. The legislative branch that created the sentencing guidelines, and the executive branch in the form of prosecutors and U.S. attorneys who decide what charges to indict for and how to pile those on, knowing full well exactly what that will lead to in terms of the sentencing guidelines. So, for example, what that means is that if a U.S. attorney decides to prosecute HSBC for conspiracy to money launder for drug trafficking with the full charges that derive from the crimes they've reportedly committed. And, there's plenty of documentation at the moment, and they have in fact been fined for much lesser crimes. If they decided to prosecute them for those crimes, then they would put the judges in the same untenable position or limited discretion position where they would have to send HSBC executives to jail for multiple decades, right? So the discretion exists, but it shifts the discretion from the judge to the prosecutor, making the prosecutor much more powerful. They can decide to use a grand jury indictment to drop charges, as they did, for example, in the Ferguson case, or they can use a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich, as the expression goes, depending on what they present to the grand jury, and then push for the full weight of federal sentencing and use that then as an extortion tactic to get a plea deal on lesser charges. What that does is it ensures federal convictions exceeding 97%, which approaches the rate of conviction you see in places like Russia and China. It actually differs greatly from the rate of conviction you see in most quote-unquote civilized Western societies, certainly across Northern Europe and Scandinavia. You never see anything approaching 97% conviction rates. And the reason for that is because they've basically short-circuited the justice system to push all of that power and authority into the hands of the executive. That is not justice. That's a rigged system.
The sentencing guidelines aren't the same across the board. For example, you have white-collar crimes, and then you have violent crimes, kind of assessed on the same point system grid. So, for example, someone like me, what I pled guilty to, would have 26 points, which stipulated 5 years. But I could throw a grenade into a church, and if it didn't kill anyone, I would get less time than 5 years. Now, you look at someone like Ross Dread Pirate Roberts, or Ross alleged Dread Pirate Roberts, his sentencing guidelines are more than of someone who raped his daughters and family and videotaped it and sold it on the internet. That person would serve less time than Ross would have to serve, according to the sentencing guidelines.
One of the things that's been really interesting to me about watching Ross's case compared to yours is that, Charlie, Ross had to be caught, and, it was hard to find him, and it took years, and there was a big investigation around that. And with you were really out there, and you were, working with a lot of the people who then wound up going after you, essentially. And even, the last time we talked about this, your thought at that point was that you probably weren't going to serve any jail time because, again, you were trying to be to make it work as much as possible. I'm curious for your perspective now. I'm curious for what that experience was like.
It didn't matter because the office of the Department of Justice of the Southern District of New York is its own completely closed off office. There's no political pressure. They don't care about anyone but themselves. So yes, I worked with the DA's office. Yes, I worked with the Department of Financial Services, just educating them about Bitcoin, not even talking to them about anything, just teaching them on my own goodwill. It doesn't matter because that's all kind of below, to a point where the DA's office even offered to help my lawyers with some things because they were like, we don't even know why Charlie got arrested. This is kind of BS. He was helping us. But it's my fault because I was somewhat naive in thinking that as much as I would help them, that would help me. Because at the end of the day, when I was arrested, I didn't even know what I was being arrested for. I read the arrest warrant, but it wasn't until after I served time in solitary, until the next morning I met my lawyers, I said, what is going on? Like, what is this about? I had no idea. And they said, well, do you know a guy named BTC King? And I said, absolutely not. Never heard of that name in my life. He said, do you know a guy named Robert Fiala? And I said, oh, yeah, I know that guy. He said, well, did you know he was buying Bitcoin to then resell to people who would then use it on the Silk Road? And I said, well, I knew this guy Fiala was advertising to sell Bitcoins on the Silk Road. And yes, I sold him Bitcoin. I mean, the company sold him Bitcoin. I said, well, that's what you're being arrested for. And I said, wow, like that is just crazy. And I still don't think it's as big of a deal. Yes, I did commit a crime and I'm guilty of it, but did I really hurt anyone? Were there any victims? Did I cause anyone damage? Did anyone die?
Well, as everybody said, pretty clearly this was about making the example in an efficient way. That's really what it strikes me, is that this was a very, you did them some favors and you made it easier for this to come down. You were probably the easiest target out there.
Charlie, I was basically going to ask a very similar question to what Adam asked, but I was glad to hear you questioning sort of the justness of the laws. Because, remember last year you were still kind of in the mindset of, they're our friends, the regulators, they're our friends. We should work with them and try to get on their good side, and then they won't be so hard on us.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anymore. You can't trust them. You'll just get stabbed in the back. I mean, I'm the perfect example of it. And all these Bitcoin companies that are going to be all up and close with the regulators, yeah, you think it's good now, but at some point, all they need is a smoking gun on you. And everything you did and everything you helped with will just go right down the toilet and it'll come right after you, just like it came right after me. It doesn't matter. You don't build up favors. You don't do anything. And I'm not saying if the government calls you up and they say, we know you're money laundering, help us out. Like, I'm not saying to say, all right, we're going to do it. We don't care about you. But I didn't listen to my lawyers in some points. I mean, even in the early days, we get calls from Homeland Security and say, can we come to your office and you teach us about Bitcoin? And my lawyer said, this can never be a good idea. There can never be anything good to get. And I said, no, let them come. We'll teach them. We want to let them know that we're a real company in an office and we're not trying to skirt the law. And we let them come and we talk to them. And my lawyer said, don't do it. It's going to bite you in the butt. And it did.
Wow, a huge learning experience. I'm sorry you learned it this way.
It's only my fault, though. I was painstakingly naive, and I was a kid. I don't blame anyone but myself for it. But it is what it is, and I have to live with it, and I will live with it, and I'll move on, and it'll be a lesson to learn for the future for other people. I feel like I got lucky in some ways. I'm only going to prison for a little bit, and this will probably help my career in some ways, and I'll push forward, and it'll be a lesson learned.
Do you think you would ever start another company?
Yeah, of course. Why not? 100%. 100%. This makes me want to do more things in the future.
Charlie, BitInstant was one of the most successful, or at least most, I don't know. I mean, you said earlier in this interview that you only made $15,000 in profit from it.
We only made $15,000 profit from that customer.
Oh, from that customer. I understand. Okay.
No, BitInstant did a few $100 million over its 3-year. I mean, we employed 20 people. We paid payroll taxes. We were doing the government well. We were paying, payroll taxes to the government. We were filing our tax returns. We were the first Bitcoin company to give health insurance to its employees. If you look at the Bitcoin documentary, the Rise and Rise of Bitcoin, at the end of it, you'll see me sitting in a conference room with about 15 of my employees eating pizza. And I literally laughed and I said, could you believe that all of this is being paid for by some guy who started some currency in 2009? And all of this is coming from that. Like, it's a crazy thought to think about. I wonder if he's watching us right now. It's crazy. Please send me books, send me letters, send me magazines. If you write to me and include your email address, I can respond back through email. I just need to be the one initiating the email. All of this data will be on my website, charlieshrem.com. I encourage you to reach out. I'll have plenty of time to read and write. Print out articles from Reddit and send them to me. I'm not going to have our Bitcoin while I'm inside, and that's what I'm nervous about.
Is there any limitation on the amount of mail you can receive?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, so for example, if someone was to create a bot that printed out the front page of our Bitcoin and mailed it to you every day?
That would be amazing, but it would be a tease because I want to actually read the articles.
Okay, we'd have to print out the articles too.
Yes, that can
Someone
be done.
Get on
no
it.
Problem. What would be really cool is someone published a weekly magazine of like the top 10 articles or top 30 articles that were on our Bitcoin that week. That would be pretty awesome. Like a printable magazine, like a PDF that could be made into a book or something.
Thanks for listening to episode 206 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. This episode was brought to you by the LTB Companion multi-token wallet, which you can now use to send tokens to other users on letstalkbitcoin.com without worrying about their Bitcoin address. Content for today's episode was provided by Charlie Shrem, Andreas M. Antonopoulos, Stephanie Murphy, and Adam B. Levine. Music for this episode was provided by Jared Rubens and General Fuzz. This episode was edited by Denise Levine and was arranged by Adam B. Levine. Have a good one.